Thank you all for coming. I am John Marciari. I'm head of the drawings department here at the Morgan Library Museum and also the curator of the exhibition Sublime Ideas, drawings by Giovanni Battista Piranesi. This exhibition was scheduled to have opened on May 29th, with the museum being closed and opening date still not set. We're not sure exactly when the exhibition will be held, probably sometime in 2021, but that remains, the exhibition schedule remains very much a work in progress. 2020 marks the 300th birthday of Giovanni Battista Piranesi, printmaker, designer, architect, archaeologist, dealer, theorist, and polemicist. We see him here in the three most familiar portraits. At left, Felice Polenzani's portrait of Piranesi as an antique bust, engraved in 1750 when Piranesi was about 30 years old. At center, about 20 years later, a bust by the English sculptor Joseph Nollekins, and then at right, Carlo Labruzzi's posthumous portrait, now in the Museo di Roma, done in 1779, the year after the architect's death. In celebration of the 300th birthday, exhibitions were planned all around the world. Shortly before it closed for the coronavirus, the British Museum opened its exhibition of Piranesi drawings, curated by Sarah Voles. You see views of the gallery there at left. But this was just one of many shows. Others were held or will be held in Rome, Rotterdam, Copenhagen, Berlin, Venice, and closer to home at the Morgan at the Princeton University Library, all in addition, of course, to our own exhibition. The Morgan holds the largest and most important collection anywhere in the world of Piranesi's drawings, and our exhibition was going to focus on that material. The last time we will have exhibited so many of these drawings, we own about 150 of them, was back in 1978 on the 200th anniversary of his death. Not only was that a generation ago, but we now know much, much more about Piranesi. There's been much new research, many new discoveries. And so this was a chance to revisit one of the core groups of drawings anywhere in the world. Moreover, while Piranesi's lasting renown is based above all on his etchings, he was also an accomplished and versatile draftsman, and the drawing board was where he developed his ideas, whether for an etched view of Rome, a design for a building, or a scheme for some elaborate decorative object, as I've entitled the show Sublime Ideas, although that title plays off of Piranesi's own words. They paraphrase a letter he sent to his sister near the end of his life, in which he wrote that he had to live away from his native Venice because he could find there, quote, no patrons willing to support the sublimity of my ideas. As I've mentioned, the Morgan holds a rich collection of nearly 150 drawings. They range from some of the artist's earliest surviving sheets to some of his very last, and they encompass virtually every kind of drawing that he made. Now, I'm not going to try to show you 150 drawings today, but what I would like to do is to give you some highlights, following a path through the artist's career and giving a preview of the story the exhibition will tell. Although the exhibition itself will include a number of local loans to round out the story, for the purpose of the lecture today, I'm selecting works only from the Morgan's own holdings. Piranesi was born on the Venetian mainland, the son of a stonemason and the nephew of an engineer, and he was destined, it seemed, for an architectural career. Yet, even as he went through his first artistic and architectural training in Venice, he also received a classical education and fostered a love for classical antiquity. It was thus inevitable that he would travel to Rome to continue his career and his training, and he arrived in the city aged 20. He joined the studio of Giuseppe Vasi and assisted that printmaker in making some of the many views of Rome, which would later be the starting point for Piranesi's own work. He was also associated with the map maker Giovanni Battista Nolli, and he went around Rome with the architectural students at the French Academy, sharing their interest in a historical and theoretical approach to architecture. His earliest surviving drawings reflect that academic and historic study of antiquity and point to Piranesi's first reaction to the magnificence of Roman architecture. Early drawings like this architectural fantasy from 1741 or 42 probably show this with a colossal facade, a Pantheon-inspired dome, obelisks, fountains, a wide stair, all on a monumental scale, with a grandeur bordering sort of on the megalomaniacal. These were indeed sublime ideas right from the start of his career. To emphasize the scale and size of this building that he had designed, Piranesi added not only added hundreds of minuscule figures, but he also had the main facade stretch to and just touch the top of his frame, a compositional device that he would adopt throughout his career, including in many of his views of Rome. A drawing like this also reflects the fantastic theatrical architecture and the elaborate perspectival studies of the Bibbiena family, or Filippo Juvara, who had died only a few years before. Still, this is very much a working drawing, not a finished work. You see the red chalk perspective line. You also see black chalk sketches at the roof lines, never quite resolved, alternate schemes in the entablature, and other changes and uncertainty throughout. This was not so much a drawing for sale, but as a way for Piranesi to think through the ideas of Roman antiquity, begin to design theoretical buildings such as were all the rage among the pensionnaires of the French Academy. And it's a drawing like this, and many more of its type, that lead to his first publication, his first independent publication, the Prima Parte di Architetture Prospettive, Part 1 of Architecture and Perspectives, which appeared in 1743. Keep in mind that although we think of Piranesi's prints largely as single sheets, most in fact were parts of series or even accompanied texts in bound treatises. That's going to be, in fact, the subject of the exhibition at the Princeton University Library, to which the Morgan is also lending. Now, what you see here are the title page and one of the plates from the Prima Parte, the so-called ancient capital to which one ascends by around 100 steps. Now, you couldn't say that the previous drawing was actually a direct preparatory study for this sheet, but you see how all of the ideas are the same. That broad stair, a pantheon-like dome, obelisks, rostral columns, all akin to what's found in the Morgan drawing. And that is one of scores of sheets that play with this architectural vocabulary of ancient Rome and of the Bibbiena family and Juvara. But those drawings become ever more splendidly free. If you look at examples like these two, where you have a kind of brilliant shorthand down to these little squiggles at the roof line here, perhaps meant to convey that there would be standing sculptures of some sort in this imagined scheme. Now, a key factor in Piranesi's evolution as a draftsman, the shift between the imaginative but rather dry previous drawing and then these wild schemes, is his return home to Venice on 2 trips in the middle of the 1740s. We're not sure exactly what his motivations were for these trips. One early biographer mentions an unsuccessful attempt to get work as an architect. But while he was there, it's clear that Piranesi studied the art of Giambattista Tiepolo. He probably was aware of it even before he left, but on the return home, he seems to have understood it in a new way. It infuses his work forever after. He also, looking around at what was going on in Venetian draftsmanship, adopts new materials. The bright white Venetian paper, this is less evident in slides than it is when you see these drawings in person, layers of golden washes, and a new language of drawing, a shift from these primarily architectural perspectival drawings to designs for wall panels, mirrors, decorative objects, this great ceremonial gondola, and also caprici, fantasies akin to Tiepolo's Scherzi di Fantasia. Looking at this gondola drawing, or rather a bisogna, one of the large gondolas that would accompany the Doge's Bucenturo during the ceremonies in the lagoon, we're looking at a sheet that is in person about 27 inches wide. Reduced to your screen, I suspect it's somewhat invisible. So I'm going to show you a few details. Here at center, you begin to get a sense of the range of Piranesi's great imagination. These great rocaille shapes that define the top, these nudes, a disembodied wing surmounted by a crown, or at the back of the ship, a dragon, a puto, or up on the prow, this sunburst, an eagle, and yet another muscular nude. there's a range of imagination and a range of fantasy here that goes beyond anything done in those first few years at Rome. And that relates directly to what Piranesi must have studied when he was home in Venice, and specifically looking at the Tiepolo. A borrowing that becomes even more clear if we look at a sheet like this great Capriccio, the only other Venetian sheet from our set that I'm going to show you today. It's been, alas, trimmed irregularly at bottom, and it's a messy drawing. You get a sense of how it combines graphite lines or chalk lines, several layers of wash, two colors of pen and ink, but a splendid fantasy, a splendid invention that includes satyrs and this great river god with water pouring out of a vase, this great jagged cloud of steam or smoke, ancient fragments, temples in the background. It is this sort of thing that leads directly to Piranesi's next set of published etchings, the so-called groteschi. Here's one of the four. And you can see how the language of these drawings is imported directly into his work as a printmaker. These are sheets that could stand alongside the greatest fantasies ever etched by the Tiepolo or Castiglione or others. By the time the groteschi are printed, though, Piranesi is back in Rome. You see down at the lower left of this sheet the Roman publisher's address. And he has also, by this time, begun work on a series of drawings that tend all now to be called the prisons, great gloomy architectural schemes. Now, a drawing like this is not inherently of a prison. I mean, there's nothing about confinement or punishment. It's just a grand architectural scheme. But of course, in a sheet like this, combining the theoretical architecture of the prima parte with the mysterious air of the groteschi, we see the precedents for what in 1749 or 50 becomes the first edition of the Invenzioni Caprici di Carceri, the work that would, perhaps even more than his views of Rome, define the artist for future generations, especially in the 20th century. There are 14 plates in the original set, and again, none of the Morgan drawings can be considered a direct preparatory study for one of them, but we can see in the Morgan drawings Piranesi thinking through the ideas. You can imagine how a sheet like the previous one informs the pier with the lamp. Now, rather famously, Piranesi reworked these plates a decade later, making them darker, moodier, making their prisonness more explicit, you might say. You can compare the first and second state of the pier with the lamp. And this boldness, this growing sense of drama, this starker graphic manner, you could say, it fits his graphic development more generally. You can see some of the differences, not only in terms of architecture, these stairways that seem to lead to nowhere that are absent in the first state, but also the addition of more figures, making the sense of confinement even greater than the first set, making it more like a prison. But my point here is that thinking about him as a draftsman, or thinking how the prisons and their first and second states go hand in hand with his work as a draftsman, we can see that same pattern happening as we look at the drawings done from the 1740s into the 50s and on to the 60s. For example, in another of his great architectural fantasies. This one, from the collection of Janos Schultz, done in the mid-1760s probably, so about 15 years later than the ones that we've already seen. And you see this there are common motifs, the great grand stairs, the triumphal arch, even the little squiggles indicating sculpture at the roofline. And yet there's become something bolder, grander, less hesitant. There's almost nothing measured in this drawing the way there was. There are no ruled lines like that first architectural design. It doesn't seem so much like a student's experiment in a fantasy of a Roman building as an almost effortless evocation of ancient Rome. Again, a rather large and very bold sheet, a clarity and a drama that goes far beyond the theoretical architecture of those early drawings. But of course, Piranesi didn't only make fantasies. If his Carceri are not his best-known work, his views of Rome are. And he made these prints throughout his career, again, starting in the beginning and continuing through his death. There are, however, surprisingly few drawings directly connected to the views. Instead, we get chance survivals, hints of his working practice. In the case of the view of the Basilica and Piazza of San Pietro, for example, one of the earliest of these views, we might note the carriage down here at the bottom, right in the foreground, which should look fairly familiar because, as Andrew Robinson noted long ago, it's in fact the central part of the great ceremonial gondola put on wheels. The great wing, the shields and medallions, the pointing nude, they're carried directly from this drawing for a gondola that surely was never built into a print that was widely disseminated. This idea of repurposing old sketches or reusing drawings or keeping, and even of keeping paper around in the workshop is something that we'll see again and again as we look through his drawings. So for another drawing related to a view, we can look at this small sketch at upper left, which is from the Thaw collection. It's on the back of a letter. You can in fact see some of the wording coming through, a letter addressed to Piranesi, indicating an address at the Dogana, probably in Venice. But then that piece of paper reused in Rome in a small sketch, postcard sized, pocket sketchbook sized, you might say, that is a first thought, it seems, for the etching of the rear facade of Santa Maria Maggiore. It's not in any way a direct preparatory scheme. The angle of perspective is different, but you get a sense of Piranesi looking at the obelisk out front and seeing how it can loom large in this scheme of the dramatic shadow and the fall of light. You sense that he was already picking his moment during the day when he thought that the shadows would be greatest to define the forms of the old basilica. And then to get one other sense of how Piranesi worked and how some of his preparatory drawings precede his etched views, we can look at this sheet of paper. What you see here are recto and verso of one sheet. So you can see here the ink bleeding through, which is this part of the fireplace design. Now I'll come back to the fireplace design in a bit, but for now I want to concentrate on this very schematic, very sketchy scene of some buildings, which in fact is a fragment of a preparatory drawing of the view of the remains of the Temple of Castor in the city of Cori, in the countryside south of Rome. Now, it's interesting to compare print and drawing because we realize how much of the actual elaboration of the views must have been done on the copper plate. Let's not forget for a moment that Piranesi was a master printmaker. He had the basic proportions, he had the basic layout, the basic scheme, the roof line, a reminder to himself that there were clay tiles on the roof and various poles and projections to hold flower pots and laundry coming out of the windows. But he doesn't bother elaborating the brickwork other than maybe with this indicating that the brickwork was modeled and that some of the stucco was falling away. He copies the inscription and notes for himself that it's going to be this great Corinthian capital, or composite capital rather. But he just gets down, it seems, enough information for him then to begin working on the copper plate and coming through to the final scheme of the etching. Now, as I say, we don't have many views that give us an entire we don't have many drawings that give us an entire view of Rome or any of the environs. There are some examples, no great finished one in the Morgan. Instead, just these hints of his working practice. In any case, although Piranesi is known for his views of Rome and his prisons, his initial training, and to a certain extent his lifelong ambition, was to be an architect, although he built very little. His best chance came in 1758, when the Venetian Cardinal Carlo Rezzonico became Pope Clement XIII. His support made it possible for Piranesi to create buildings at last. Two important projects follow. The reconstruction of Santa Maria del Priorato, the Church of the Knights of Malta up on the Aventine Hill, and a scheme to design a new choir at the Lateran Basilica. There are a range of drawings at the Morgan and elsewhere for Santaré del Priorato, quick sketches, casual designs, and the like. Some of them undoubtedly executed by professional draftsmen in Piranesi's studio rather than by the master himself, others clearly a collaboration between master and assistants. For the great facade of the church, at the Morgan, we have only one drawing, a design for this ceremonial scabbard, for this element on the pilastra of the church, a scabbard with the arms of the Rezzonico family. There's a similar drawing at the British Museum, showing how the drawings were split up, scattered after Piranesi's death. And these are just tiny fragments. This drawing at left is maybe 3 or 4 inches in height. Looking at other drawings for the church, we could go inside and we find both a very loose, probably a very loose drawing, probably an initial sketch for the high altar, and then a much more carefully rendered drawing. Here we see most of the basic elements that would appear in the final work. The apotheosis of St. Basil at the top, accompanied by angels, or putti rather, the medallions, the use of a sarcophagus. These candelabra don't appear in the final scheme, although they would be used elsewhere by Piranesi. And then here, a much more carefully rendered drawing. Still not quite the final scheme. There are subtle changes between it and the final work, indicating that it's still probably preparatory rather than a record of the finished project. It's interesting, too, that in this more careful drawing, the figures are all absent. The Virgin and Child, that would be the relief stucco on the central medallions, the figures of the angels, the putti, and St. Basil at the top. Now, Piranesi was never very much of an architect, of an academic draftsman. We'll see more of his figure drawings later on. He was good at the quick sketch, but he wouldn't really have made a careful drawing that would have been so terribly useful to the sculptor, Tommaso Righi, who in the end carved this high altar at the church. So perhaps this is what Piranesi supervised and then left the actual designing of the figures to Righi, although of course very much with Piranesi's approval and consultation. But there are no drawings by the master himself other than these rough sketches. Now in the case of the Lateran project, we have very different sorts of drawings. Again, some casual designs, but also grand, elaborate, carefully rendered presentation drawings. For a variety of reasons, the Lateran project never came to fruition, but a splendid series of drawings survives, divided mainly between the Morgan and the Avery Library at Columbia. Again, there are some rather more loose drawings, as well as carefully rendered schemes on a grand scale. This bottom drawing is 5 feet wide when seen in real life, giving you a sense of scale. There are alternate ideas, and there's no steady progression from the looser to the most finished, from the smaller to the larger drawings. Instead, we see Piranesi trying idea after idea. In the large one, for example, he's come up with this idea of a window piercing the dome and letting light in here, whereas in this earlier one, you see windows in the dome itself. You also see the addition of this ambulatory or retro choir. It's interesting, though, to look at these drawings from the 1750s and to go back to a much earlier drawing, this one, also at the Morgan, which must have been done originally around the time of the prima parte in the mid-1740s. Although these dark lines in the bolder pen, this more graphic, you could say bolder graphic matter, must have been added later. But when and how late is hard to say. Nonetheless, if you look at this scheme for the apse of a church with a screen of columns leading on to a distant choir, you see something very similar to what Piranesi actually designed for the grandest of the drawings, the most finished of the drawings at the Morgan. This, again, I think says much about how drawings were kept in the workshop and of how in the ways in which an idea developed in one drawing might be reused years and years later, something we've already seen on a smaller, closer chronological scale with the Venetian gondola that became a Vatican coach. Now, while a truly preparatory drawing, a carefully finished drawing for a Roman view, for example, is less likely to survive, something that was an interesting idea might be kept around the workshop for decades and reused in various ways. One of the most interesting places to see this play of ideas and drawings and the use and reuse of earlier ideas is in Piranesi's designs, his designs for decorative objects. If he was ultimately frustrated as an architect, he was notably successful as a designer. He had the clients. For his prints had become necessary, almost essential purchases for any tourist to Rome in the 18th century. English grand tourists again and again in their diaries talk about their visits to Piranesi's palazzo. He had clients. He also had access to fragments of antiquity through his work with the excavators and his recording and debates about the excavations. Finally, he had the imagination to take those ancient fragments, encase them in modern creations, and sell them broadly, especially to tourists who may or may not have realized that what they were getting could be, in many cases, 90% modern with a few ancient fragments built in. This is certainly the case with the fragments that became what we now know as the Warwick vase. What you have here is a letter, again at the Morgan, from Piranesi to Charles Townley, the great English collector. Now, the letter doesn't even describe the drawing. The drawing must relate to a discussion that Townley and Piranesi had previously had, in which Piranesi is setting out a scheme for how some fragments that he had managed to get his hands of might be reworked and put into this great composite object. But he designed a range of objects: vases, candelabra, mirrors, clocks. This is a design for a clock in the shape of a pine cone. Chairs, coaches, maybe even a coffee pot or two. And you can see these appear in his prints. There is, in addition to the earlier design for the Vatican Piazza that uses the gondola as a coach, one of the later prints of the Vatican uses some of the designs like this, some of the later coach designs as the coach in the foreground. But perhaps the best canvas for Piranesi's invention was the chimney piece, perhaps because it was a clean slate. The mantelpiece or chimney piece was essentially a modern architectural form, but it was a blank canvas to which Piranesi could apply ornament drawn from virtually any source: Egyptian, Etruscan, Greek, Roman, pure fantasy or imagination. It's at the moment that he was making drawings like these and designing objects that correspond to them that Piranesi was most engaged in contemporary polemics about the merits of Greek style versus Roman style. Whereas Winckelmann and others were arguing for what they saw as a severe purity of the Greek style, Piranesi was a great lover of a profusion of ornament and a kind of eclectic acceptor of all designs. He, in a way, starts the Egyptomania that would actually reach its height several decades after his death, but which was certainly inspired by his Egyptian interior for the English coffeehouse, although most people at the time didn't know what to make of it, or designs like this chimney piece in Egyptian style. Other designs could take natural forms. We see elephant heads here. Elsewhere there are dolphins, birds, other creatures. It's not quite clear, for example, what this little creature up here is meant to be. And down here, another creature where, as if to remind himself what he was thinking, Piranesi has even written in coniglio, rabbit, down for the figure at the bottom of this chimney place. No evidence that it was ever actually made. Eventually, in 1769, Piranesi would publish a range of these designs as his Diverse maniere di adornare I camini, his diverse manners of decorating a chimney piece. But he'd already been making the objects and working on drawings like this for years. The Morgan has a large collection of such things. Some might be related to specific plates in the Diverse maniere, but again, the case is more often that you see him playing with ideas that could be mixed combined, recast, redone, elaborated, or simplified in the final plates or in the marble chimney pieces that he actually had carved and sold to the tourists. Like all of his drawings, they're best understood as a set of thoughts and experiments, showing the range of his fantastic imagination. We also see in this drawing at upper right, a figure, not in any way related to the chimney piece itself, but rather probably just tossed off because Piranesi saw a man sitting in the workshop and decided to sketch him. This seems to have been the inspiration for many of his figure drawings. They're figures captured in a kind of impromptu mode. And often they run into or overlap other drawings on sheets of paper. It's as though he would be busy doing one thing, see a figure, and then decide to draw that figure in one of his quick sketch. And as I said, he's never a proper academic draftsman, but he had an amazing shorthand and an amazing power of observation. In the exhibition, we're going to have a whole wall dedicated to the figure studies, meant to show the range of these sketches. Here are two examples. At left, for example, this sheet from the Schultz collection. It comes from an album, supposedly comes from an album that was unearthed in Paris in the early 20th century and long since disbound and sold off as individual sheets. It's interesting that at least in this case, the 4 figure drawings remained on one sheet. Very often we see these as single figures on small fragments of paper. They're perhaps the most common drawings that come to the market because so many of them were cut from other sheets and continue to be recirculated. This is not a large sheet. You see how it's been folded in quarters. It may have been a letter or a draft of a letter at one time, although it's so firmly laid down on a backing sheet we can't see the reverse. But even the smallest of the sketches on this sheet, this figure, who can only be 2 or 3 inches high in real life, show you just the brilliant shorthand. I imagine what we have here is a man wearing an apron, probably one of the printers in Piranesi's workshop. And you can imagine him sort of engaged in some argument about the workings of things in the studio. Similarly, on another sheet, and here you see the entire sheet, men with aprons. In this case, they seem to be, again, printers loading the paper or the copper plate into the press, and then here, perhaps holding a sheet that's just come through the press. And drawn over other sketches, as is often the case. He just picked up a piece of paper, possibly one that he had been working on just at that moment, possibly an old sheet lying around the studio, and just begins drawing. The rest of these studies show the transept of the Lateran with various architectural details and notes in Piranesi's own hand, presumably a sheet done in the mid-1750s when he was otherwise thinking about the redesign of the Lateran. Now, here again, we have architectural sketches that don't relate to any specific project. Piranesi was never rebuilding the exterior of that scheme. He's just making notes for himself, perhaps for a view, perhaps for the rebuilding. We see figure sketches on ornamental and decorative designs. We see whole sheets of drawings cut up, flipped over, reused. It's a messy business trying to sift through Piranesi's drawings. But as I said, the Morgan has examples of virtually every type. And while I've shown you perhaps 20 or 30 of them already, we'll have, I think, 80 in the final exhibition. Now, I've shown you many of the drawings, but to bring this story to an end, Piranesi was not that old when he died, only 58 years old, but his health had been in decline for a while. Still, the continuing excavations down south at Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Pozzuoli were a strong draw. And in the last years of his life, Piranesi, accompanied by his son Francesco, by the architectural drafting assistant Benedetto Mori, and perhaps others, went to the south. I mean, one can see a kind of evolution of Piranesi's style in the drawings from these late trips. In this big study of Pozzuoli, for example, a drawing nearly 3 feet across, we see him using a thick reed pen. And he's using maybe what could be described as bolder systems of hatching and a even more schematic shorthand for the figure than in his earlier views. Now, perhaps this is just an instance of an artist evolving into a late style, or perhaps the aging and ailing Piranesi realized that Francesco or another assistant would ultimately be responsible for translating drawings like this into prints, and so the simplified schematic style would be useful there. In this case, the ruins of Pozzuoli were not well understood. They were thought at the time to be a temple. It didn't make much sense, partly because it was in fact a marketplace. So Piranesi doesn't give you a very analytical drawing here, but rather something more like an evocative view of ruins. The case is different at Pompeii. At the Morgan, there are two drawings of the Temple of Isis. It was perfectly well understood what this was as was being excavated. Now, here, in what might be two of the latest drawings that survive from Piranesi's hand, we see something more schematic still. Again, these are very large sheets, over 3 feet wide, each of them, which gives you some sense of how thick the lines are. But schematic, and in fact, they may have been initially begun not by Piranesi himself, but probably by one of those architectural assistants, the draftsman, like Benedetto Mori, who laid out a carefully measured and ruled scheme, atop which Piranesi, with his thick pen, started adding hatching and shading. He worked up the feel of the drawing atop a much more careful architectural framework. The other drawing of the Temple of Isis is more schematic still. And in fact, here, Piranesi's hand can only be considered responsible for part of the ink work. These lumpish, large figures without life and entirely out of scale to the building are hard to believe. It's hard to believe that these can be Piranesi's own. Likewise, that gray wash, sloppy, with none of the sharpness, with none of the drama of Piranesi's own, seems to be the addition of some later hand. And in fact, these are probably additions by his son Francesco, who would eventually use many of Piranesi's latest drawings and make prints of them himself. It's hard to imagine that this is not posthumous addition, the dressing up of measured drawings by the son, perhaps for sale. It's hard to imagine that Piranesi would have allowed this at the time without correcting it as he corrects many other drawings. For indeed, we know that Francesco would, after Giovanni Battista's death, use some of these late drawings as the basis for new prints. He would also continue printing from his father's copper plates. And eventually, Francesco also gathered up many of the drawings surviving in the studio and began selling them off in groups. Hence, there are sets of Piranesi drawings, a group in Berlin, a group fairly recently discovered in Karlsruhe, and others that must have been put together in the studio and sold off together. And indeed, 133 of the Morgan's 150 drawings constitute what must be the most important group to have remained together in one such collection. I've shown you a good number of these today, but there are many more, and much more to say about all of them, of course. But this is really just meant to be a teaser, and I look forward to the moment when we can put them on display in the exhibition and when you'll be able to see them there. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for a wonderful presentation. We do have some questions. And again, for any of our attendees, if you have a question, please feel free to add it to our chat and we'll try to get to as many as we can during this Q&A session. Our first question is, how did the Morgan come to have so many Piranesi drawings in its collection?
So the provenance of the big group, the 133 that seem all to have been together, is an interesting story. We don't know for sure where they even come from. They were given to the Morgan by, they were originally owned by Jane Grew Norton, who was the wife of J.P. Morgan Jr. She was primarily a book collector, and it is suspected that she bought an album with the drawings in them from one of her London booksellers. By the time the drawings were first placed on deposit at the Morgan in the early 1940s, they seem already to have been disbound and matted. So we don't even have a binding that we can trace back for any kind of provenance. And then the drawings were formally given to the Morgan in 1960s by Mrs. Morgan's sons. Yet the presence of other groups, there are similar sets of drawings for the chimney pieces in Berlin, for example. And there are cognate drawings in Karlsruhe suggest that there were these groups put together out of the studio and that were then sold off as sets of some kind and that remained together. It's one suspects that the Morgans group went to some Englishmen and then were sold in London to Mrs. Morgan from there. The additional drawings, the 15 or so or 18 beyond the original gift of 133 are a combination of select purchases. There are multiples that come from the Schultz collection and the Thaw collection, and then some other gifts along the way.
Our next question is, a few people have asked about the term used in the title Sublime, and how is that used, or why was it used for the drawings of Piranesi?
I mean, the sublime is a real 18th century concept. The idea of something that is sort of, how to define it, more splendid than life itself. Something that is so splendid, it creates an almost visceral reaction in the viewer. I mean, you get a sense of a scale beyond anything that was ever actually built in these drawings, for example. As I said, I like the title. It was playing off of an idea that Piranesi, or off Piranesi's own words describing his work to his sister. But it's a nice term that's very much in the spirit of the late 18th century when he was working.
Can you say more about Piranesi's Egyptomania, and how did it start? What were the sort of key motifs that he was using?
Sure. I mean, of course, he has in Rome his greatest source for Egyptian design are the hieroglyphs on the various Egyptian obelisks that were and still are in the city. With the great debate about the merits of Greek versus Roman architecture and then how Etruscan fits into that, Piranesi comes even up with the scheme that, the Egyptian architecture gave birth to Etruscan architecture, which gave birth to Roman architecture. But essentially, he's an eclectic. He believes that all ornament is good. All ornament can be used in the way the Romans did. The Romans amalgamated Etruscan motifs, Egyptian motifs, etc., in their own, the ancient Romans, I mean, and Piranesi is trying to return to that. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not a deeply studied or deeply understood appreciation of Egyptian architecture. It's more by motif and ornament. It's a decorative language that he could adopt, and he used it, as I said, above all in his decorations for the English Cafe at the bottom of the Spanish Steps. It doesn't survive, but it's recorded in prints, and then in these chimney piece designs. And he picks up standard motifs. These static figures, eagle's wings, and the stuff that he could have copied off of hieroglyphs. And then it's after his death that, and because of his publications like the Diverse Maniere, that especially in England, through the agency of the Adam brothers and others, it really takes off at the very end of the 18th century and becomes a kind of standard design for a while.
This sort of connected with what you showed in terms of the Egyptian style. Do any of the mantelpieces survive?
Yeah, I mean, they're around. I mean, there are some in English country houses, there are some in museums. So, I mean, simple answer is yes. I mean, you can find examples of them. There was a show at the Cooper Hewitt, was it 20 years ago, Piranesi as Designer, in which a number of the surviving ones were included and are illustrated. It's a pretty easy catalog to find. I think much of it's still online as well for those who are interested.
Our next question is, does Piranesi comment on the reuse of compositional elements in his own correspondence or publication?
Does he comment on the reuse of compositional elements? I don't think he does. I mean, although he, in beyond the sense that he would borrow from motifs from here, there, and everywhere, but I don't think he ever explicitly says, this motif which I previously used on the facade of Santo del Priorato, I am reusing on a chimney piece or anything like that. It's something that you just begin to realize. You see common motifs. You see an ancient fragment that he copied into one view of Rome as one of those bits of ruined architecture and sculpture in the foreground, then makes its way into Santo del Priorato as part of the stucco design, and then makes its way onto a chimney piece. I think the idea that he kept these drawings around, and they, and this approach he had to ornament, of applying ornament to surfaces, meant that individual motifs could be mixed and matched and reused.
And this will be our last question. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Were the figures that he draws within his drawing plans, architectural settings, were they ever drawn to scale to provide the viewer with a sense of scale, the other elements of the drawing?
Not in the fantasies. Like the drawing that's now on screen has no scale. I mean, even the way that he's drawn the framing lines around it suggests this was a kind of drawing for the sake of drawing. Some of the architectural drawings for the Lateran have scales at the bottom, but as a general rule, no, they're more sort of inventions for idea rather than carefully delineated designs. There are one or two of the wall panel designs that seem measured with some scale markings on them that may have been for some specific project that he hoped to a specific commission he hoped to get or something like that. But generally, no. Generally not. There is not scale.